here. Why don't we call to order with a roll call?
All right, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Shambliss.
Can you hear me?
I can now. Shambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Ferguson. Ferguson. Fredson.
Here.
Gonzalez.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom. Lindstrom. Musso.
Here.
Sterner. Sterner. Vento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Zarin.
Present.
Cherzelli.
I am here. We have a quorum. Next item of business is to look at the agenda. And we really are getting several presentations and an opportunity to really learn a lot today. Unless there's an objection, I will consider the agenda approved. And on to the minutes from October 21st, that long ago, 2020, regular meeting of the Committee of the Whole. And is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Wolf moves approval.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf. Is there a second? Okay, thank you, Mr. Dog. What?
Second by Gonzalez.
Thank you, Councilmember Gonzalez. Any discussion, additions, questions? All right, Bridget.
All right, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Aye.
Shambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson. Ferguson. Fredson.
Aye.
Gonzalez.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom. Lindstrom. Musse.
Aye.
Sterner. Sterner. Vento. Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Zarin.
Aye.
Cherzelli.
Aye. Well, those minutes are approved. Okay, as you can see from the agenda, we have 3 presentations, but they all relate to each other. And this is really going to be a great opportunity for us to think about some of the long-term issues that we all care about in our region, and really relates around the community development area. But ones that facts, and then we are actually have some outside visitors that will join us from the Urban Land Institute later on. So I think we're going to really learn a lot. I've been looking forward to this day, and in order to kind of set it up, I really want to call on our community development director, Lisa Barjaras, who will kind of give us a little context and maybe introduce the groups that will be presenting. And knowing that as we think about our work on the last 2040 Thrive Plan, it's amazing that even though we didn't adopt it as a council, a previous council did, we've really been living a lot of those values. And now we're going to be in the starting stages of thinking about the next 10-year plan. And that kind of is going to be part of our responsibility. And so this is an opportunity for us to really learn, ask questions, and engage with some real experts about areas that we all care about. So, Lisa, are you going to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. Really excited for this opportunity. This last couple of years in the beginning of your administration, we've really been in the throes of reviewing comprehensive plans, which I know jumping in at that stage can be a little bit overwhelming. But what we'll be doing in the coming year, especially, is turning toward our long-range planning efforts. We're in that stage of the cycle where we're rounding out review of 2040 comprehensive plans. So we'll be reporting back to you on what we learned in aggregate from all of those plans, what has changed, what's new, as well as not just in land use, but across all the variety of topics from wastewater to parks to natural resources, to how communities engaged with their residents in that process, or maybe not so much. And then look forward, we'll be getting census data, and we also have a lot of impacts today that we're experiencing on the ground that we'll be starting to think about, well, what does this mean for us going forward? So today is one of those foundational conversations for you, and while we do have some presentation, we really want to open the forum for you to engage with our panelists, especially for the majority of this meeting. So what we'll be starting with is a report out on some development trends that we've been seeing so far, talking about what we've experienced in this current year, which has been somewhat unexpected and harder to track on how sticky things might be going forward, whether or not what we're experiencing today will last, and if it will last, how long it will last. The pandemic itself, what it will mean for our work going forward. And we have some very talented and experienced individuals on our development panel today joining us from the community, and Kathy Bennett from ULI, also from the community from ULI, to help organize that conversation and kick that off. So with that, I will turn it over to our staff, who will be giving some presentations on our overall development patterns that we've been seeing, especially in 2019, and what we've seen so far in 2020. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joel, who I think will be doing our first presentation. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks, Greg. Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. Good afternoon. My name is Joel Nias, and I'm a researcher in the Community Development's research team. And I will be presenting on the findings of our annual building permit survey. We'll be taking a broad look at the building permits and regional development patterns for the year 2019, or as entitled in this presentation, or maybe better called the before time, as in before 2020 and all that brought with it. It's kind of older data, which the reasons for the lateness I'll get into later. So basically, this will be a snapshot of what the residential and non-residential development for 2019 permit data looked like prior to the year of 2020, or pre-pandemic era. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today's item, informational item, is we'll describe how we develop our building permit survey. We'll share findings about pre-COVID development trends. We'll include the volume, location, and types of residential and non-residential construction. And then very briefly share early and limited 2020 data from non-council data sets and publications that might shed some light on what our 2020 data will look like. We also hope to provide high-level context for the next presentation by the transit-oriented development team. Next slide, please. Before I start, I will do my best to answer your questions, but I may call on assistance from staff members. If the question doesn't get answered, it might get answered at the end of the presentation by the panel. I'd also like to acknowledge team members who contributed to this presentation and data. It's an online survey, so there's quite a bit of information, and it's most specifically in the Information Services Department. So acknowledgements to Jim Dudley, Elias Anthan, the recent retired Julie Opitz for helping out, and then as well as the research staff, including the soon-to-be retired Deb Conley, Matt Schroeder, and Krista Riba Torres. So a lot of people's work went into this, and it's greatly appreciated. Next slide, please. We've been collecting community summary level residential data since 1970 and address level residential data since 2009. We've also been collecting address level non-residential data since 2003. The survey is developed in collaboration with local governments, and it's a great example of a strong working relationship between the Metropolitan Council and local governments, where they give us the raw data, the number of permits, permit values, types of units and addresses, and so forth. We make sure there are no duplicates. We validate the data against other data sets. This year's response rate was almost 96%, which was a little lower than in previous years, but much harder to come by this year. The goal of the survey is to take a single comprehensive look or an annual snapshot of the residential and non-residential building permits of the region for a specific year. There are research firms that delve into certain aspects of permitting data. Some work with multifamily units, some work with single family only units, others work with commercial data. We try to incorporate all different residential and non-residential types into our analysis and offer it at the address level. Next slide, please. So what do we capture in the residential portion? We capture housing type, whether it be single family detached, townhomes, duplex, triplex, and quads, and multifamily units. We capture the number of units associated with each permitted unit. We capture the permit type, whether it's new construction, demolition, so the additions and subtractions from our housing stock. We capture the location or address of the units, whether it has an age restriction component to it, and we also capture the permit value. Next slide, please. What we capture in the non-residential portion, we capture non-residential type, which are commercial, industrial, public, and institutional. The classifications, whether they're such like hotels, manufacturing plants, warehouses, schools, etc. We capture the square footage, the permit type, new construction, additions, or remodels, location or address, and also the permit value. Next slide, please. Next slide. Before that, Greg, please. And one before that. What we don't capture for the residential portion, we don't capture tenure and affordability, which has building permit survey as a base data set for it, but this will not be completed until this coming spring. We also don't capture when units are built or the number of bedrooms. Next slide, please. For the non-residential, what we don't capture is when the units are built. We don't capture leasing prices or number of jobs associated with the construction of the project or the number of jobs created after construction. Next slide, please. So our usual timeline goes like this. We send out the survey to all communities in the 7-county region in early January. We compile and clean the data in early April, and then we present the data in May. As I brought up before, that obviously didn't happen this year. The surveys were sent out in January, but by March there was a lag in response rates, which only got worse as summer approached due to COVID-19 work restrictions by community staff, and then the civil unrest later prolonged the acquisition of the data. We were finally able to close the survey in early September, and hence the December presentation of 2019 data in almost 2021. Next slide, please. How do we share our data? We share information on our website through community profiles where people can see summary level data, data visualization tools where data users can click around on a map and gather information. We also share our data spatially with the Minnesota Geospatial Commons, giving mapping data to whoever wants to use it. Next one, please, Greg. For our own purposes, this data set is an extremely important input into other data sets that we developed, such as our population and household estimates. And it's also a foundation for our affordable housing production data, and also recently helped advance the complete count in the 2020 census by making sure the Census Bureau knows about all the residential units that have been constructed from 2010 to 2019. Next slide, please. So what were the regional development patterns takeaway at a very high level? Next one, please, Greg. And here. So looking at the residential permitting data, the 2019 data shows that the region's residential markets continued on an upswing, and the region's non-residential permitting activity hovered close to the previous few years. 2019 had the highest annual total of new housing units permitted since 2004, and the residential construction remained relatively consistent based on permit value. The increased residential development was not enough, though, to overcome the housing shortfall that we've discussed in previous years, hence the title of 2017's presentation entitled We Need More Housing, and last year's presentation, We Still Need More Housing. Population growth still outpaced housing, and we still have a large shortfall compared with our peer regions. And we'll also look at some limited 2020 data that shows the market disruptions due to the pandemic. Vacancy rates for rental units are up, and rental prices are flattening in some rental markets. And residential construction may have fallen considerably. Next one, please, Greg. In 2019, communities in the region permitted almost 21,000 new residential units, which was the highest level of permitted units since 2004. Next one, please, Greg. And that is beating the historical average of almost 15,500 units from 1970 to 2019. So even though we aren't at the level of housing production of the early 70s or the late 80s, we are getting closer to the pre-recession housing numbers and getting farther above the historical average. Next slide, please. So we know there are other permitting components that affect the housing stock by adding or subtracting units. There are demolitions that subtract housing units. There are warehouses or commercial units that get converted to residential units and are added into multifamily residential. There are remodeling projects that can add or subtract units. So to get to the overall supply, we really want to focus on net housing change, taking into account all the additions and subtractions. Next slide, please, Greg. So in getting to the net change of residential units, here are some numbers from 2010 to 2019. We start with the largest number of permits added, which are the new units. Next one, please, Greg. We add on a small number of conversions into residential units. Next one, please, Greg. And then a small number of other additions, such as units moved into community, and that's in the darkest blue. Next one, please, Greg. And then we subtract small demolitions, that's in the orange. And next one, please, Greg. And a small number of other losses, the orange and red. And then after we add up the additions and subtractions, we come up with the net change. So looking at the overall net change rather than just new units can be important, especially in areas where there are a lot of tear downs and rebuilds, so as not to overstate how many units are being produced. Next one, please, Greg. We didn't track all permit types prior to 2000, but looking at 2000 forward, it shows kind of the same theme that we aren't at the pre-recession peak in units added, but still above the 2000 to 2019 average. Next, please, Greg. But the common question remains, though, are we keeping pace with the population household growth in relation to our residential building activity? Next one, please. We have increased our housing supply as estimated by the Census Bureau. This chart shows the growth data from the Census Bureau showing the housing unit change for the Twin Cities, which is in green. The other 11 national peer regions are as identified by greater NSP in gray. Well, the Twin Cities is kind of in the middle, but slightly towards the end for housing unit growth. Compared to our peer regions, we have increased our housing unit supply as estimated by the Census Bureau by about 6.5% since 2010, which is ahead of only Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, and San Francisco. Next one, please, Greg. So the next question is, are we keeping up with the population change, which is the blue dot? And we are not. Our 6.5% increase in housing units is not keeping pace with the 9.4% increase in population, but many other regions are not as well. So a takeaway from this chart is that we are not alone in keeping up with population growth. It's not just our issue, most of the other region as well. Next slide, please. To look at the extent that housing supply is falling behind population growth, if we divide these two, we can get a better sense of that. Next slide, please. While there shouldn't necessarily be a one-to-one ratio of housing unit change and population change, it's still a rough measure of how our housing shortfall compares with other regions. This chart shows the housing shortfall where we have the third highest percentage shortfall among our peer regions, ahead of Atlanta and San Francisco. Last year, our shortfall was 38%, so progress is being made. But relative to our population growth, we are not building enough housing. But it is important to note that the housing shortfall is really a national phenomenon. It's not just limited to our region. Next one, please. And then the next one. So there are a variety of housing types being permitted. According to our building permit survey, multifamily units make up the bulk of the permits issued since 2010 and is increasingly becoming a larger portion of the units being built. Next one, please. So we add on the relatively small number of townhomes. Next one, please. And then we add on the number of duplex, triplex, and quads units, which has pretty much vanished over time. Next one, please. And then add in the single family detached units. The takeaway from this graph is that all types kind of follow the same trends, even when the number of units dropped through the Great Depression, and then the multifamily market took off before the single family market did, with over 14,000 multifamily units being permitted in 2019. Next one, please. When you look at all of the housing types across the whole decade, single family detached units have accounted for 34% of the units permitted. Duplex, triplex, and quad units actually lost units. Townhomes accounted for 7%, and the multifamily accounted for the largest portion with 60% of the total. Next one, please. When we compare the permit types from the last decade to the forecasted types of housing that were part of Thrive MSP 2040, we see that 70% of housing built between 2010 and 2040 were forecasted to be multifamily and attached housing, and 29% were forecasted to be single-family detached. What we've seen so far this decade is 66% multifamily and attached housing and 34% single-family detached housing. Next one, please. So this next slide goes into detail about what some people call the missing middle. These are attached housing types that are generally less expensive than single-family detached units. They take up less land, they share walls, and they can be more energy efficient, and generally have less square footage than single-family detached homes. Next slide, please. So looking at townhomes in a historical context, they made up 1/3 of all single-family permits in the previous decade, from 2000 to 2009. Over the course of this decade, 2010 to 2019, they have made up about 1/6 of all single-family permits. Looking at duplex, triplex, and quad units, we actually gained 42 units in 2019, but have seen a net loss of over 400 units over the last 10 years. Next slide. And then accessory dwelling units, where the region has added 30 units in 2019. In 2018, 19 units were added, and 27 units in 2017. So again, these units that tend to be less expensive, not many are being added. Next slide, please. As we talked about earlier, most of the units permitted between 2010 and 2018 have been multifamily units, but not all the units are targeted to the general population. This chart breaks down the components into 3 categories. The dark purple here shows the units permitted to the general population, which means they are not geared towards an age-restricted market. Next one, please. There are a small number of units geared towards students, predominantly around the University of Minnesota. Next one, please. And then we have the units geared towards older adults, which is shown at the top of this graph. What's noticeable in this graph is that multifamily units have increased in recent years, but specifically in 2018 to 2019, there's also a slight downtick in the number of age-restricted housing for older adults from the years 2019 to 2018. Next slide, please. And then looking at the share of these units over the last decade, we see that 67% of the permitted multifamily units were aimed at the general population, 5% for students, and 28% for older adults. So looking at the cities with the largest net change in 2019, the takeaway from this graph is that Minneapolis has permitted more units in 2019 than in any other year since we started collecting the data since 1970. This was also the case in 2018. So Minneapolis has achieved the status twice in the last 2 years. Majority of the permitted units are multifamily. Another takeaway from this graph is there are a lot of different kinds of cities on this list. There are urban core cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. There are rapidly developing suburban cities like Shakopee and Lakeville, as well as communities that are fully developed like Burnsville and Bloomington. Next slide, please. Looking at the region as a whole with a choropleth map, it shows the broad pattern of where units were being permitted in 2019, with Minneapolis being the obvious outlier there. Next slide, please. And then looking at the housing activity across the region spatially over the last decade, we again see the broad pattern of activity with Minneapolis again being the outlier. Next slide, please. And then if we look at communities by their Thrive MSP 2040 community designations, approximate 12,400 units permitted per year from 2010 to 2019. We see that 30% were in the urban center, 9% in urban areas, and then approximately 56% in suburban edge, and emerging suburban edge areas. And then we see 4.5% in the rural areas. Next slide, please. This was quite a shift from the previous decade, where 15% of the approximately 14,000 units permitted per year were in the urban center, and then approximately 71% of the permitted units were in the suburban edge, and emerging suburban edge areas, and then 9% in the rural areas. Next slide, please. As we talked about earlier, we also capture non-residential building permit activity in our annual survey. The next presenter, Amy Yoder from the TOD office, will be going over this data in slightly more detail. So I'll just go briefly over the results from the 2019 survey. As you can see on this time series, the region permitted around $2.4 billion worth of projects in 2019, which was roughly the same as the previous handful of years. The 2014 number you see in this graph is a bit of an anomaly. This was the year CHS Field in St. Paul and US Bank CM in Minneapolis were permitted. So that had quite a bit of the yearly total. Next slide, please. As we talked about earlier, we categorize our non-residential data into three categories. Commercial, which would include retail, hotels, offices, eating and drinking establishments, and other types. Industrial, which would include warehouses, manufacturing, distribution centers, and others. And then public and institutional, which would include schools, hospitals, government offices, religious buildings, public work buildings, and others. Highlighting the largest permit value by type on these maps, we see that the Omni Vikings Lakes Hotel in Eagan had the highest commercial permit value in the region in 2019. The Renewal by Anderson plant in Cottage Grove had the highest industrial permit value. And for the public and institutional projects, the new Minneapolis Service Center had the highest permit value. You can see the other top 5 projects listed on this as well. Next slide, please. So we've already talked about the takeaways from the 2019 building permit data and the broad development patterns. So now real briefly, I'd just like to go over some 2020 data and other market trackers. We won't be collecting our annual 2020 permit data until next month, but there are some other data sources that might help predict what our data will look like next year, or might be answered by the panel discussion at the end of this council meeting. Next slide, please. So what are we seeing in the 2020 data? Next slide, please. 2020, most economists agree that we are currently in a recession due to the pandemic, but residential permit activity should still be robust in 2020. For the ownership market, market might continue to the region, but there might be a buyer's market and others specifically related to areas with a lot of condo units. There is a limited inventory in some areas, which is driving up prices. Currently, there are very low rates. Which dipped to 3.01% in November last month. A year ago, it was 3.88%. For the rental market, there have been COVID-19 related construction shutdowns and stoppages. There are overall rising vacancy rates and rental price flattening. There is a pause in the renter defaults. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has prohibited evictions nationally through the end of the year. And then for non-residential construction, we might expect a decrease in permitting activity. Next slide, please. So here's a graph from the Census Bureau on comparing the data from the Census Bureau's September 2019 and September 2020 building permit survey. We see that there's an approximate 1,000 unit difference from 2019 to 2020, mostly in the 5+ or apartment or condo category, but still relatively a robust level of permitting activity. Next slide, please. I'm looking in the Minneapolis area Realtors data of inventory of homes for sale. We see that there is a decrease in the number of units for sale, with a 34.5% decrease in units for sale from October 2019 to October 2020. Next slide, please. And most of the decreases of the inventory is for homes for sale in the single family detached market, but there seems to be a surplus of units for sale in the condo market. Next slide, please. For rental units, looking at 2020 data from CoStar, which is a commercial and real estate data firm, we see that the overall rents flattened from 2019 to 2020. but vacancy rates rose to 6.1%, which is above the 5% vacancy rate that most analysts use as a balanced vacancy rate. If the vacancy rate falls below 5%, rents could go up due to competition for rental units. If the vacancy rate rises above 5%, there may be a surplus of units. But these rates are not uniform along all rental types. Next slide, please. Vacancy rates climbed dramatically for the Class A properties, which are usually the newer luxury apartments, but not so much in the more affordable Class B and C properties. Next slide, please. And in looking at rent prices, we can see that Class B and C properties had a flattening of their rents, while the Class A luxury properties had a slight dip in rents from 2019 to 2020. Next slide, please. And in looking at non-residential construction activity moving into 2020, we might expect a dip in permitting activity from 2019. From the data in the Dodge reports, which is a research firm specializing in non-residential construction, we see that from the third quarter of 2020 report, so this would only be 3 quarters of the year for 2020, it shows that the Twin Cities region is quite a bit behind the output of 2019. We probably won't match the 2019 totals, even if we extrapolate this green bar by another quarter. Next slide, please. And here's my contact information, and if there are any questions, and thank you for your time.
Joe, that was really data rich. A lot of information you've covered, and I know we have 2 more panels, and we'll have a chance to interact with our final panelists. But we should open up for questions now, and maybe I'll just jump in. You know, when you think about the growth in our region, and that we're not keeping up with and this is in housing units, but you could never go back and replace that big dip that was so evident graphically from a kind of low point of 2010. And what I've heard in housing is like we're behind even before there's this gap, even though we've recovered and we had a lot of housing starts, particularly in Minneapolis, but we're just never going to recover this huge, lack of product given the gradual population increase. Is there but I'm surprised that rents are flattening given that big, we're behind. Maybe other cities are that way. How does that affect the next 5 to 10 years?
Boy, I would almost have to forward that on. I don't know if Joel Hudding is on this call right now. Joel, do you have any input on like the flattening rent prices?
Well, yeah, I do, Chair, council members. We have just really started diving into this, honestly. And so we've been looking at vacancy rates and rent prices, and we're definitely seeing vacancy rates go up. And I think what we're kind of, I agree with all your previous comments that we've been behind in housing production for a long time. We have been catching up in a lot of areas, but still have not produced as much housing to overcome that shortfall. I don't want to give too much information because we just haven't dived into it deep enough, but it does look like there's some kind of differences spatially throughout the region as well, where you have seen a ton of production in Minneapolis in recent years, and Minneapolis is a place where we've seen vacancy rates really start to climb up a bit. Again, we don't really know all the root causes of that. Minneapolis is another place where we have seen rent prices start to come down. I know that's not a great answer. The real answer that I would have is that these are trends that we are still diving into to really understand what's going on.
Well, stay tuned. Any other questions, council members? Riva?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm kind of curious about the housing gap. Is it just straight population to housing permits, or is there another level that you've researched? For example, what about access? What if we have an increase in population of people who cannot get access to housing either through lack of jobs or lack of income or other barriers to housing? Have you looked at that at all?
Mr. Chair, council members, I actually have not. That's a little bit out of my area of expertise. But that is something we can, I'll take note of that and we can look into that, and I'll share that with the other staff members in the research unit.
Okay, great, thanks.
Molly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To what do you attribute the loss of duplex, triplex, and quadplex, the net loss in housing type? Why are we losing those?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the difference between like a duplex, triplex, and quad unit and a townhouse unit, it's kind of a little bit of a fine line there. So basically for a townhouse unit, it's just a unit that kind of looks the same, and they're just sharing a wall and they keep going sideways. Whereas a duplex unit, they have a couple different categories. One can just look like a single family detached home that's carved into like multiple units inside. Others may have a stacking component to it. And then others would have like a common entrance. And then once you get into the common entrance, you have your own entrance into your unit. So the little bit of research that I've done, possibly with the duplex unit, sometimes there are stairs involved, which with people that have limited mobility would not find that desirable. But other than that, yeah, there's it's kind of just a little bit of a fine line between other, other attached housing units.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Judy.
And then just, I want to validate this, but I think I know. And also, while we're producing a more robust number of housing units, they trend to upper income households. So, although I did see quite a few multifamily, but again, multifamily can certainly mean luxury apartments, right? Like in downtown Minneapolis or anywhere else. So I think, we also know homelessness is increasing. So there's just in the market, as rents are coming down and there's a bit of softening there, it's all still so tight. So for example, in a home or townhome that's valued at $250,000 or under, I mean, if it hits the market, it's got multiple offers on it and everybody better be ready to go. So, there are just so many pinch points within the market, and that's why, trying to build or preserve affordability is so critical. And to Molly's point, even some of those duplex, triplex, and quads, are oftentimes, some of our most affordable naturally occurring housing, and we're losing those, whether it's through redevelopment or just being flipped and the rents go up. I don't know. So it's just interesting. I appreciate all this data and how it continues to roll out with all the questions that we've got. It'll be good to continue to track.
Well, let's move on with Amy Yoder here is going to give us a consideration about how this fits with transit and some of the transit-oriented developments. So, Amy, are you ready to jump in?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Chair and Council members. Greg, can we get that PowerPoint pulled up? Awesome. Thank you very much. So, as the chair mentioned, my name is Amy Yoder. I am a planner in the Transit-Oriented Development Office at Metro Transit, and I'm here to present about the 2020 Development Trends Along Transit report. This report is not ready to be published quite yet, but will be coming out sometime at the end of the year or in the very beginning of 2021. Next slide, please. The Development Trends Along Transit report uses many of the same data sources from our last presentation. Community Development and their research unit put together the annual building permit survey, which was reviewed so wonderfully by Joel before, so that cuts down on some of what I need to talk about. And then we also look at the council's development tracker, which pulls from media coverage in order to estimate kind of what developments are in the pipeline and are coming up soon. looking at those data sources, we are looking at the development that occurs within a buffer of high frequency transit, which is all transit ways that operate 15 minutes or less on weekends or weekdays, between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. and on Saturdays between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. So that's some local bus routes and also bus rapid transit and light rail transit. The red line and the North Star do not meet that 15-minute or less headway, so they aren't included. The development types that we're looking at include multifamily residential, where we're looking at 2 or more units and focusing on new construction, in addition to several non-residential development types, commercial, public and institutional, and industrial. For those, we are looking at both new construction and conversions or renovations, because we also consider conversions and renovations to be investments in developments that are near transit, and thus we're looking at. One thing that we do exclude from this report is anything related to an airport or to, say, transit utility projects. So next slide. When we're looking at these transit ways, we have tried to narrow things down so that only developments that were permitted when developers had a reasonable expectation that the line was really definitely going to happen and definitely going to be located where it is being located are included in our analysis. So we're looking at permits that are issued after a new starts project enters project development, a small starts project also enters project development, or an arterial BRT project has a council approved station plan. So these are fairly definite. The money's on the table, things are moving, but because of how the data is set up, we only look at calendar years for that. So you can see below the transit ways that are included in this and the calendar year of permits that we are looking at for this report. Next slide, please. This map just shows kind of the basic transit ways that we are looking at. You can see it includes both existing built-out transit ways and some of the planned transit ways that have hit those benchmarks that I just mentioned in the last slide. The buffers that are shown in gray are a half mile around a station area or a quarter of a mile buffer surrounding high-frequency local bus routes. Those high-frequency local bus routes, we only include permits as high-frequency local bus route if they aren't also being counted under a transit way. So if there was a high-frequency bus route that qualified before the scene line started, a permit from before the scene line would be counted as high-frequency local bus, but not as scene line, if that makes sense. This data wrangling gets kind of complicated, but it shows us some really cool things. What we started getting into what the data tells us this year, we can see that in 2019, just under 37% of regional development value was slated for areas along high-frequency transit ways. And those buffers, those transit ways, make up just 3% of the 7-county metropolitan region. Next slide, please. Looking at permitted developments since 2003, and then since 2009 for residential permits, we can see that $13.8 billion has been permitted along high-frequency transit. Of that, we can see 43% of the development of the permitted development value has been, of the residential permitted development value has been along high-frequency transit, with 39% of commercial value, 29% of public and institutional value, and 7% of industrial value being located in those high-frequency transit way buffers, which is a total of 35.5% since 2003. That total percentage, 35.5%, is pretty much the same that we were reporting last year with the data that went up to 2018, but some of the 2019 specific years numbers have gone up, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Of all of that development value, it's particularly interesting to note that over 34,000 multifamily units have been permitted along high-frequency transit, which is 40% of the multifamily units in the region. You can see in those bullets that kind of the largest number of units are being located near LRT station areas, with an additional chunk that are near BRT station areas, and then also over 10,000 units that are along high-frequency local bus routes. If you note that those numbers don't add up to 34,200, that's because in some cases permits are being counted both for LRT station areas and on BRT, so they can be counted, kind of double counted there. But when I give a number that is a regional analysis, no permits are double counted. So just kind of keep aware for that, and feel free to ask questions if if I need to be more clear about some of those numbers. Next slide. This chart shows kind of the regional total permit value in yellow, and then under that is the dark blue, which hopefully shows up on everyone's screens, which shows kind of the total of permit value along high frequency transit for each of those years. Now we can see from 2009 up to 2019, there is a definite upward trend, both for the regional development value, but also for the development that is being located along high frequency transit. As was mentioned in the last presentation, 2014 is a bit of an outlier. So it does include that US Bank Stadium, I think it's just under 800 million that's included in that year. So that US Bank Stadium will be removed from our next slide. And can we do next slide, Greg? Thank you. Here I've taken just the permit value that has been located along high frequency transit ways and broken it down by development type. In most years, residential multifamily development has made up the largest proportion of development going in near high frequency transit and generally in the region. You can see here we have removed US Bank Stadium from 2014, and those numbers look a little bit more consistent with the general trends. In 2019, we saw a very high amount of development permitted value going in for residential, for multifamily along high frequency transit, as was mentioned with the regional analysis in the last presentation. So it's almost $1.2 billion have been invested just in permit value along high frequency transit. Next slide, please. Here we're going to get into some of the maps that make up a lot of this report. There's many more maps that will be in the final report if you're really into maps. This is just a selection here. Looking at the residential, multifamily residential value, these dots that you can see show both the permit value in millions, kind of, you can see smaller dots and bigger dots. Dots that are a fully vibrant color are those which are included in a transit way. Dots which are faded out are those which are outside of both the geographic and time buffers for that. With multifamily residential permits, we can see kind of the expected clusters along high frequency transit ways and major downtown areas, commercial corridors. You can see significant value and investment going into both downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul, kind of following the expected patterns from the last few years. So that's the 43% of multifamily residential value from the region is located in those high frequency transit ways. Next slide, please. Now, the non-residential permit data goes back to 2003. So this is actually an even larger collection of time that's represented on this map. Looking at the commercial value, it's the same map setup. We can see kind of, again, the expected clustering of developments along those high frequency transit ways, and in particular in places where high frequency transit ways like LRT or BRT intersect with high frequency local bus or with other local bus routes. Kind of you see these clusters of development at the intersections of these really amazing transit networks. And again, kind of the expected clusters of value near large commercial areas. Next slide, please. looking at public and institutional value, there's a lot less of public and institutional permitting going on throughout the region, but we do see the kind of well, I suppose not that expected, but we do see a 29%, that 29% of that public and institutional permits are going in near high frequency transit. Significant pieces include in downtown Minneapolis and in downtown St. Paul, where there's been investment in the capital or in, like was mentioned, the Minneapolis, I think it's the convention center that had a lot of investment recently. And then not included in this presentation, we also looked at industrial permits, which makes up the industrial permits going in near high frequency transit make up 7% of the permit value in the region. Next slide. So moving into the kind of second chunk of data that we analyzed for the Development Trends Along Transit report, we also looked at the planned developments that are included in the council's development tracker. From this data, we are seeing almost $9 billion in development that is being planned along high frequency transit, which of that $8.9 billion, 62% of that is mixed use, which is primarily commercial and residential. So these are developments that are talking about having a first level commercial space or something else like that, in addition to housing. Of the total development planned in the region, 68% of it is expected to be near high frequency transit ways. That's 5.6 billion being located near LRT stations and 4.9 billion near BRT stations. All of those figures are up from what we were seeing last year with the planned data. And most amazingly to me is we're actually anticipating 35,000 new multifamily units being located along high frequency transit, which is 43% of the units planned in the region, which is just really cool, especially since we've been talking about kind of the lack of housing and what we need to do to meet that need. Next slide, please. So first, this map shows just the planned multifamily residential sites. So these are developments that, from looking at the media that's been presented, the development tracker has identified that these developments only have multifamily units. So this is excluding the mixed use commercial and residential, which will be on the next slide. Looking just at those developments, which are expected to be multifamily residential, pardon me, I have seasonal allergies. It's not COVID. So looking at the planned multifamily residential sites, we can see there is expected clustering along some of the both established and upcoming high frequency transit ways. One of the things that as a transit planner I find particularly reassuring is we're seeing significant amounts being planned for along the Green Line extension. One thing to note with these planned developments, however, is that since these are developments that are being presented in the media and are getting media attention, some of the kind of less popular transit ways that aren't as big of news might be getting underrepresented. So where you look at the Orange Line, different things like that, I can't say for certain, but I think it's possible that there might be some underrepresentation for some of those lines. Next slide. Here we see the planned mixed use sites, which again, 99% of those are commercial and residential. There's significant clustering along all of our high frequency transit ways. One thing I'm particularly excited about with looking at this slide is that there's continuing investment along existing transit ways, like the Green Line and the Blue Line, where kind of conventional planning wisdom might have expected just an initial bump when the large capital projects went in, and then a tapering off from there. But what we're actually seeing is that there's continually increasing market demand along these existing transitway lines. And looking forward, 76% of the mixed-use development in the region is expected to be along high-frequency transit. So you can see kind of the bulk of the little yellow dots there are within those high-frequency transitway buffers. Next slide, please. So to bring everything back together, what this report is indicating to us is that we can see the region's growth has concentrated along high-frequency transit. So as our transit network has grown, the market has also grown alongside it and building off each other together. So 43% of multifamily units built in the region during this study are located near high-frequency transit, and 35.5% of total regional development since 2003 has occurred along high-frequency transit in just 3% of the regional land area. Looking specifically at 2019, it's up to 37% of all permitted value in the region being served by high-frequency transit. And looking forward, looking at the planned development data that we have available, we see an additional 35,000 units of multifamily housing that are planned to be near high-frequency transit, with 68% of all planned developments being within those high-frequency transitway buffers. So I find this really heartening, and I'm excited to be able to bring this story to you. And next slide. I'm available for questions. You can either direct them to me now during this meeting, or I've also included our Metro Transit email address for anyone who wants to follow up. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Amy, and great presentation, and that is encouraging. I mean, we keep thinking, boy, transit just doesn't have the access to people, but the trend is really rapidly changing with all this development. Any questions for Amy Yoder? Riva?
Here I go again.
Yeah,
Okay,
hey, great.
Yeah, it's a good, very good and informative presentation. I have a similar question to my last question and that is with, 40% of the, what was it? 40% of the multi-units near the high-frequency transit areas. I'd like to see what the affordability levels are near the transit areas, just to see how we're doing in terms of having a diverse mix of housing and how we're doing in terms of planning for access to housing. As we are planning these developments and as we have populated the developments, what are the economic demographics of those households or the prices of those units? I'd be interested in seeing that as well.
Amy?
Absolutely. Chair and council member, it was briefly mentioned in the last presentation, but we're actually going to have new affordability data coming out in 2021. So once we have access to that affordability study and survey, we'll be able to give you much better numbers for that. So keep on the lookout. We'll be getting back to you when we have the data.
Okay, and you said that should be coming next year.
Councilmember, I believe Joel said that that's Q2 of 2021, but that's coming out of the Community Development Office, so I will defer to them.
Okay, thank you.
I also appreciate, Amy, that when you look at some of this mixed-use development and some of the permits, that they're following not just our light rail, I would call it, significant investments in transit, but on the arterial bus rapid transit, and particularly I see the A line and the line. So this isn't just our big invested transitways. There are kind of a lot of the future development we're going to be looking at along these bus rapid transit corridors, which are also frequency. Chris, you have a question.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Amy. I'm wondering if you could go back to slide 9. And what jumped out at, I think it was slide 9, and what jumped out at me was the parts of the metro where it looks like we have a significant amount of new development going in, and yet we don't. It's not served by high frequency, either LRT or BRT, or even necessarily local bus. So I mean, you know, in my district, you know, Rice Street, and then, you know, what would dip down along Robert Street into West St. Paul, and you can see these corridors. I think in the West Metro, that must be 394, where there's a big stretch there. But I just thought it was interesting to see where I think you see this development happening, and potentially these folks are underserved as it relates to transit. And then the other question that I had was related to any kind of a comparison of LRT versus BRT. And I feel like LRT got a head start, right? Just because the blue line moved forward, and then the green line, and now you see this recent investment, and I think that, you know, BRT is our future, but I'm interested to know what the difference is as it relates to the rate of investment or total investments along BRT lines versus LRT lines, sort of factoring in that LRT got that head start. I don't know if that makes sense as a question, but it's what came to mind.
Yes, Chair and Councilman Fredson, those are both really good observations and comments. With some of those kind of visible lines that we can see that aren't being included in this study, they are being served by transit. It's just transit that perhaps doesn't meet this 15-minute or less high-frequency transit way. Many of those communities also are what we would consider kind of transit-ready communities. So that's also something that kind of Metro Transit, I hope, will take into account. So I'm right there with you on that observation. Regarding your second question, doing a comparison of LRT and BRT, I'm going to have to kind of primarily direct you to the full report when it comes out. The full report will include more detail on that, and we'll break down some of these numbers by those kind of different transit way modes. I could talk about this data probably for 3 weeks straight and still not get into all of the detail. So this presentation has been a bit high level, but when we get you that report, we'll have it.
Riva?
Yeah, I just wanted to say from my experience in working with the LRT developments, there is definitely more rapid investment along the LRT lines and significant investment along the LRT lines. So one line had $5 billion of investment in a rapid period of time for the LRT. There's going to be a significant difference between that and the BRT investment, at least in the short term.
Right. Thanks. Judy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to Councilmember Fredson's question, good question. And that's why maps are interesting. We had a discussion about this in a previous meeting today. So when you do look along what would be 394 as you go out from the big red bubble in the middle out directly to the west, I mean, you've got the local suburban transit providers that are doing express service into downtown from those job centers. So my hunch is that those bigger light red bubbles are because they are being serviced by transit, and certainly Southwest and Apple Valley Transit. In Maple Grove Transit, you see again a lot of investment up along that corridor, of course, 94. It's outside of the lines that are shown for transitways, but they're being served, but I'm guessing maybe it's not meeting the 15-minute thing, although I would think some of those express routes in our suburban communities would meet that. Or are we just choosing not to put other people's transit routes on this map to illustrate why there could be some of those larger investments being made in those corridors? And I guess I'd like to know what the answer to that is.
Yes, council member. I can only speak as an employee of Metro Transit. So that's kind of the limit that we've been putting on it. I don't know. I think Lucy Galbraith is the director of TOD, is in on this call. She might have something to add on that question.
Lucy, a comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair and council members, and thank you, Amy, for all of this work. I believe that some of those have very frequent peak hour service, but we were also looking for good midday service and for weekend service, so that the idea was we wanted to pick out transit ways that were kind of useful for all trips and not primarily work trips. So if you notice, the red line's is not on there, and it was because of these kind of gaps. It is true that many of the express bus routes have very good service during the peak hours, but they didn't meet this cutoff. And I guess we could consider going back and looking at some of these other transit ways, but we were trying to make it, could you sort of live along transit idea?
Mr. Chair, if I might just add, and if we could get slide 9 back up again. I just think for illustration purposes, it's nice to just be able to layer some of that information on there, because it gives the impression that, we're trying to tell something here, right? And while we only control Metro Transit and we've got our parameters around what we're trying to demonstrate, I think it's still important to acknowledge that there's significant transit being offered outside of Metro Transit, which if we're putting the bubbles of investment along those corridors, I think it's somehow important to at least note that there's other providers out there, whether you just geographically shade the region and note who the provider is, or I don't know, but first of all, this is really great information, super awesome, love it. But I think for communities like mine, that's where you tend to feel like left off the map, literally. Like it just kind of stops in the middle of Hennepin County. And I recognize it because Metro Transit doesn't go beyond there. But as a region, we do have transit beyond there. And if there's any relation to the investments that are being made, I guess I would like to somehow notate that. But I'm speaking on behalf of somebody who has communities that, and I understand the purpose of this, but quite often just feel like we're left off the map.
Lucy, do you have a thought?
Well, thank you, council member and chair. And I think that what we can do in the report, first we'll go back and look and see if we did inadvertently leave out any qualified regional service providers using our criteria. But the second thing we can do is we can add in a map that shows this, but also shows more transit lines, because, this leaves out a lot of our transit map, both Metro Transit and the regional service providers, by just concentrating on the very small number of high frequency transit ways. So I think we could add another map. I'm adding tasks to Amy's list right here, but add maps that show the larger transit network, that show more of the connecting service to these major transit ways, and that second map might help address your concern, or I hope it would.
And again, I don't want to pull away from the precise information you're trying to share here, but I do think it would help. And to be perfectly honest, because the suburban communities could not get this kind of service to them, that is why they operate their own systems. and they still can't get to this level of service even on their own when they pull back the money into their communities to provide their own services. So I just think it's worth putting some sort of notation or footnote or marking or something, because a lot of investment is being made, again, not maybe perhaps in these parameters, but it's impossible to do it outside the system. And that's simply why those other providers originally existed. So I appreciate that thought. I mean, I'm not trying to make more work for people, but you know, when we're trying to talk about investment, commercial investment, and we saw the presentation earlier where significant investments are being made, I think we're just missing something there, because some of that is being serviced by a level of transit.
And Amy, do you have a comment? And then I see Angela patiently here, so we got to get to our panel, who are our wonderful guests who have joined us here. But go ahead, Amy.
Yes, council member and chair. One thing that we could do is we could produce a map like you were talking about, Ms. Johnson, Councilmember Johnson, that does lay those other transit providers over. That's certainly something that we could produce if that would be useful for the council.
Great. Thank you. And Judy, the points well taken. So we've got to make sure that's included. Thanks, Amy. And you know what? As Amy Yoder just said, we could spend 3 hours just on one subject. We're covering a lot of different issues here, and I'm really thrilled that we have. Oh, I'm sorry, Wendy. Did you have a quick comment?
I'll try to be quick. It follows along on Judy's comments. My district isn't even on the map, and I understand, you know, zooming it in so you can see better, but there should be some maps that show the entire region, because there's development that is happening in those other parts of the region, and that will never be served by high frequency transit. The part of the region that's actually served by high frequency transit is very small. Like they said, 3% of the land overall. But you know, that's the system that has the ridership, but there's development going on elsewhere, and I don't want to give people the impression that our region ends at Burnsville.
It goes farther? That's what I mean. Oh, cool. Okay. Thank you, Wendy. I totally agree. And we were just having the same conversation at the meeting earlier, which Councilmember Johnson was part of, and we need to, when we look at maps, they become very they're laden with information, and we kind of layer in our concerns on them. But sorry, Angela Torres, who is going to kick off a panel where we have some guests who have really are so gracious, to sit through our committee of the whole meeting, and also provides your expertise and engage in a dialogue with our council members. So with no further delay, Angela, are you going to kind of set up this panel, and we'll get a chance for a conversation?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and I completely agree. It's an exciting conversation to have. I'm Angela Torres, the Manager of Local Planning Assistance. I'm going to introduce our partnership with ULI just real quick. ULI has been a great partner as we work with them to expand technical assistance to local governments, as well as connect us to the experts that are on the panel today. Kathy Bennett is here from Urban Land Institute, Minnesota, to help moderate the discussion. Kathy has worked with the Urban Land Institute and the Regional Council of Governors since 2008, where she manages the advisory services team. This work has included facilitating over 100 work sessions between public officials and the private nonprofit sectors related to general and complex land use issues. She has 25 years experience in public and private alliances, program development, TOD, and project management in all facets of housing policy, development and redevelopment planning, and strategic implementation. So, similar to how the chair said, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to introduce our panelists.
Great, thank you, Angela, and Chair and council members for having us here this evening. And I'm really excited about this, and I think the data that was presented before really kind of is going to help the panelists really dig in to some of the details and issues. As Angela mentioned, my name is Kathy Bennett, and I manage ULI Minnesota's advisory services. And I'll serve as the moderator for tonight's panel discussion with 3 key real estate leaders who I'll introduce in a moment. I also want to recognize ULI Minnesota's Executive Director, Stephanie Brown, who is also listening on the call tonight. Next slide, please. So first, just a quick summary of ULI and ULI Minnesota for those who may not be familiar with us. ULI Minnesota is a district council of the Urban Land Institute, which is a nonprofit research and education organization supported by its members and sponsors. ULI's mission is to provide leadership in the use of land and in creating thriving communities worldwide. ULI was founded in 1936 and has over 35,000 members worldwide. Our mission at ULI Minnesota is to engage public and private sector leaders to foster collaboration, share knowledge, and influence meaningful strategic action in the responsible use of land to create thriving and sustainable communities. Next slide, please. So how do we accomplish our work? Through the support of and dedication of our sponsors, like Metropolitan Councils, our real estate leaders, and the Regional Council of Mayors, which ULI Minnesota has supported and coordinated since 2004. Since then, participation in the RCM has grown from 8 mayors to over 60 mayors. The RCM meets monthly, currently now over Zoom, like everything else, to share their knowledge and experiences and to work together on regional issues. They are very committed to candid dialogue in nonpartisan setting. Several of your council members that are on the call today were former mayors and were part of the Regional Council of Mayors, Councilmember Lindstrom, Cummings, and Johnson. And I'm sure they can talk about the value of the Regional Council of Mayors. Next slide, please. In 2011, ULI Minnesota facilitated workshops in over 85 since 2011 in over 85 Minnesota cities. This is a really slide that's full of information, and I'm not going to read all of this, but it's really about impact. And I wanted to highlight a couple of things. In 2019, 14 cities that we held workshops in approved housing developments with various financial tools and land use tools. Also, 32 cities supported policy and zoning changes that increase density and create a higher priority for affordability. Next slide, please. So this is a map. We love maps, and I know you saw a lot of maps tonight, but this is our impact map. It shows where all the workshops that we've held in the metro area. The darker colors are those that held more than one session, mostly due to policy leader and staff changes. And before I get into the panel discussion, I just want to really thank Metropolitan Council for the support of this work. We would not be able to do and offer these sessions for all of these cities without your support. So next slide, please. I'll kick off with a few targeted questions for the panelists, and then we really hope to have a discussion with you in the time that we have. But first, I want to ask each of the panelists, Noel Noor Companies, D'Angelos Svensson. I'm so sorry, D'Angelos. I try so hard to say your name, and every time I get it wrong, with NEO Partners, and David Wellington with Wellington Management. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and just give a little bit of a summary about what they are. And you can stop the slide share now. So Noel, please introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Noel Noor. I'm incredibly excited to be here. Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me and to be part of this panel. And thank you, council members and chair for having us here. I'm really excited. My name is Noel Noor. I am the CEO of Noor Companies. I run a construction and development firm that's a social enterprise. It's a for-profit social enterprise. We're based in Minneapolis, and I've been a member of ULI, and you know, the council has supported one of the projects that we are working on. That's affordable housing project. I work primarily on commercial construction, primarily working for large clients in the Twin Cities. And I also do affordable housing development and community development, primarily addressing large sort of immigrant areas in South Minneapolis and in the metro area. I think Kathy invited me for a number of reasons, but I'm really excited to share a little bit about the work that we did in the areas that were affected by the social unrest following the George Floyd murder. And I will let the rest of the panelists introduce themselves.
Thanks, Noel. DeAngelos?
Thank you, Noel and Kathy. DeAngelos Svenkason, CEO and founder of NAO Partners, Inc. We're urban planning and real estate development consulting service firm here in the Twin Cities, based in St. Paul. Similar to kind of a lot of things that have been said today, overlap with the work that we're doing. We're currently working on a study trying to figure out how to get more 2 and 4 unit developments for owner occupants in the Twin Cities. We're working in Ramsey County right now on the Ramsey County Economic Competitiveness and Inclusion Plan, one of the first one in the state to really look at their economic development plans for the county in a very different way. And we're also servicing a number of small businesses and medium-sized organizations in their real estate needs. And so not only does our work overlap on kind of the major corridors impacted by COVID and the civil unrest, but stretches around our 7-county metro area.
Thanks, DeAngelos. David?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invite, Chair, Council members. Kathy, thank you. Great discussion. My name is David Wellington. I'm a co-owner of Wellington Management with my dad, Steve. He started the company back in 1984. It's as mentioned, family-owned company that owns and manages about 100 commercial assets in the Twin Cities that make up about 4 million square feet. We have about 550 commercial tenants in the portfolio in 23 different communities in the Twin Cities, both suburban and urban in our orientation. We have in-house property management and leasing for that commercial portfolio. And then we also have a smaller development team that is working on a variety of different development projects right now. We have many projects in the pipeline, both on the affordable housing, the mixed income housing, market rate side, and commercial office and industrial as well. We are the largest private property owner at the intersection of Lake and Hiawatha and sustained significant damage after the riots from George Floyd's murder. We lost about 35 million in total assets during that destructive event and are rebuilding all of those. One of them was an affordable housing project that Met Council has participated financially in. I can assure you that we are well underway with rebuilding that project, and we're about 10 months behind schedule. But I'm here to talk about kind of what we're seeing in the marketplace, both on the development side, but also in the leasing front as well.
Great, thanks, David. What I'd like to do is just start with you. From a developer's perspective, what are the current trends you're seeing in the industry? How have you had to shift the way you do business? And what do you see as long-term impacts beyond the challenges of 2020?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're seeing, I think, impacts from both COVID-19, the pandemic, and the public health shutdown reverberate throughout our entire business. And, you know, I have to put my ownership hat on in a different way than I put my developer hat on, because what the developer hat is really looking forward into time, 3 to 5 to 7 years or longer. And that ownership hat is really here and now. We're trying to solve problems for our existing tenants that are in a lot of trouble. So I'm in charge of all of the inbound leasing discussions related to the pandemic throughout our entire portfolio. We have about 195 retail tenants in our existing portfolio throughout the Twin Cities. Most of those are smaller tenants, 5 to 10,000 square feet. A lot of them are single location operators. And so we get to know those tenants over a long period of time. We tend to hold our property for, decades and develop deep relationships with a lot of these businesses. About half of them reached out to us as a result of the shutdown in May and June, the governor order for the pandemic. And there was a lot of fear and concern about how long that shutdown was going to persist and whether or not their businesses were going to be able to recover. And so we were able to provide some flexibility and some generosity based on the partnership that owned the property, as well as how flexible the banks were going to be with us. We saw most of those requests for flexibility or generosity from those tenants start to die down towards the middle and end of the summer. We lost about 15 tenants to bankruptcy or just deciding that they didn't want to persist with their business. And now we're starting to see requests start to pick up back up. We've seen maybe 5 or 7 tenants request for more generosity and flexibility recently as a result of the most recent shutdown. And so we're working to try to keep folks in their space through the winter and hoping that the spring and summertime will look a lot better for everybody. On the development side, the construction pricing for housing is not cooled off whatsoever from what we can ascertain. We are actively in the market right now pricing a couple of projects in and around light rail stations, I'll have you know. And those pricing exercises with well-established contractors are seeing an increase on a per unit basis from last year. And part of what we're hearing is that that's really tied a lot to lumber and continued constrained labor force on the residential construction in particular. So framing division, the other divisions that are not exclusive to residential are actually starting to loosen up a little bit. So divisions that are kind of 3 and above, 3, 2, and 1, earthwork and concrete are starting to get quite a bit more competitive. And so we're seeing some of the pricing in the earthwork and concrete start to come back to us a little bit, which is a welcome sign. And we're also hopeful that lumber pricing will start to come back down in 2021 and that our contractors can do well with buying lumber for their 2021 and 2022 starts. I think that's all I had kind of in the prospective, and I should stop talking now.
Noel, DeAngelos, do you have anything to add to that before I go to the next question?
I would just echo what David said. I would say on the workforce development side, on our side, one of the things we noticed is that there's a disconnect between there's a shortage in workforce development, which is the traditional white male, and then there's an availability of non-traditional workforce, and there's a gap between the training and the development side. And so a lot of the unions are working on that, and some of that is helping with the availability and the shortage of workforce. And I think that's something that certainly the Met Council, especially along the policy front, when you do fund these projects, especially affordable housing project, I think it's a key critical component to make sure that we strengthen the funds available for that.
So Noel, let me stay with you. There are many significant events in 2020 that have impacted the way we live, work, and play. What have you learned through these events, and what are your ideas on how government entities like the Metropolitan Council can better collaborate to rebuild unrepresented communities, and in particular, ways to directly benefit the people and places most impacted?
So Kathy, as you know, COVID-19 and council members, COVID-19 kind of forced us to sort of slow down and reassess the system in the way we live. And as a parent, I live that every day, and we operate that and the way we function. The design of our housing, the design of our spaces are not necessarily conducive to the needs of COVID-19 community. And those designs and the systems that we have are significant detriments to the communities of color, in particular Black communities, Indigenous communities, and immigrant communities. And because most of those communities do live in affordable housing, and they also live in housing that is not necessarily meeting their needs. And so one of the things that we've noticed, at least as a developer, we think about, and I try to put the hat of what do we need to do going forward, is access to internet is a critical component as we build residential housing and affordable housing. Parents typically, especially around communities of color, parents are most likely to fit into the essential workers, and so they don't have the ability to stay at home with their children when school is not in session. And so as a result, some of those parents are pushed to the limits and are becoming homeless. And so the homeless community is growing significant. So having access to affordable housing that's conducive to the communities is really critical. And then the other piece that we noticed around health is the feeling of isolation, the heightened feeling of isolation around nursing homes and seniors, especially in communities of color where immigrant communities really thrive. If you go to the Horn Towers in the city of Minneapolis, for example, you'll see a lot of seniors that used to hang out together a lot. That was their social sort of connection. And with COVID, that also completely had gone away. And so how do you connect? They're not necessarily going to be connected through the internet. They may not necessarily know how to use an iPad. And so what does that mean? So I would say these situations really helped us to think about, they drive catalytic opportunities to undertake in large infrastructure projects that change the way we build. And so how do we create community spaces that can provide health and wellness and safety for people if we do have pandemics like this? And especially around rebuilding efforts on Lake Street, access to transportation that's easy, access to affordable housing around the corridors. So for example, Lake Street does not have a lot of affordable housing. I'm excited to see the affordable housing that's going up as a result of Wellington management. But we need more of those so people are connected to places that they live and work and that it's easier for them to commute. And so those are a couple of things that when we're thinking about for the next 5 to 10 years, and as a result of COVID and as a result of this unrest, those are a couple of things that, we're thinking about, and it would be helpful to have from a comprehensive plan standpoint when it comes to the Met Council's plan to include those things as well.
DeAngelos or David, anything to add?
Yeah, this is, I think we've seen talking points put out there that we're in the middle of facing 3 pandemics at once, some related to race and racism, some related to the more of just kind of the recession that's hit because of the slowdown in kind of economic activity. And then we also have a health crisis, public health crisis in our midst. And so as we consider those things, and then we consider like who is, everyone's impacted universally, but then there's also those who experience pain differently. And I think Nawal touched on, there are some very targeted groups and populations in the Twin Cities that are experiencing pain at a much different interval and at an accelerated rate than I would say the macro population in the Twin Cities area. And so when we look at what can be done, I think there has to be an intentionality around the healing, the economic healing, particularly. Joel did a great job earlier kind of recapping the housing trends and that we are, almost habitually behind the supply needs to keep up with population growth. And so we have to balance the equation of housing supply creation with economic development initiatives in this metro that focuses on job density and not just retail job density, but living wage job density, entry-level access job density, particularly around these hardest hit communities. And that goes into a much broader conversation around land use density, and access to transit that, this kind of interwoven, interconnected world of the built environment that we all experience. But I think we have to be realistic around the economic impacts, and not just from a, housing standpoint, but when you look at COVID wiping out almost 50% of African-American businesses, we're talking about substantial income replacement that has to come from somewhere. And if we're not going to have huge stimulus from our state, county, or federal avenues, I mean, where are we going to replace that income from? And we have a much, I think, a understated challenge ahead of us over the next 10 years. And the public sector can't do it alone. And so I think there's an opportunity to use the platform of the public sector to champion for more private investment, more philanthropic investment, and also for the state to get some of our retirement system dollars off the coast and back into our own backyard.
David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think all those thoughts are very salient and prescient. I would just kind of focus on the area where I think I know best, the lake in Hiawatha and along Lake Street and West Broadway in particular, and University Avenue. Those three corridors were, hit very hard from the unrest. And, we can have constructive dialogue about whose responsibility that was, but I think it's a fair comment that nobody's responsibility, or none of the businesses were responsible for that unrest and the damage that they endured. And I think we're fundamentally failing by not reinvesting in those corridors, because those are the gems of our city or our cities. And that's the cultural fabric that makes up, very unique parts of town that we really need to hold on to. And a big piece of what makes those places really precious is that they had low rent environment for commercial businesses. And we, as a developer and an owner of a bunch of commercial property, I know exactly how much it costs to go build new commercial property. It's 20 or 3 times as expensive as the stuff that burned down. And so you just don't have the opportunity for businesses that are coming out of a pandemic recession to be able to go get themselves, liquid enough or strong enough credit to have a landlord like us to get comfortable with signing a 7-year lease and providing a bunch of tenant improvements for us to invest in that business and assuming that it's going to go okay. That's probably not a bankable transaction for us. And so there's a gap financing opportunity for us to really hold on to, affordable commercial space, which I think is at the heart and soul of who we are as Americans, but we haven't come to terms with the fact that, we're losing these kind of precious locations of cheap commercial space, and they're not going to come back. We're just handing it all to Jeff Bezos. And I don't know that we want that. And so I think it's hard to have a discussion about what we need to do without really kind of pointing our fingers at, well, we're losing all these like wonderful, precious locations for all these small businesses to be able to operate and to have ideas and be, kind of inventing the future and trying to sell cheaply into those neighborhoods that they really want to thrive in. And so that's kind of my soapbox.
Yeah, I think D'Angelo's kind of building off of that. In your work, you serve people and businesses who are entrepreneurs, those small entrepreneurial businesses. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges, but also opportunities for entrepreneurial businesses and developers?
There's a part of me that's a little defeatist about the moment, because we're just so much in the muck and the mire of it that it's hard to be inspirational. But then there's the other half of me that looks at, there's an entire generation that hasn't gotten into what I would say the entrepreneurial game yet. They're the employees at existing institutions. They're working as sous chefs, etc. They've been doing it the right way. They've been working, gaining knowledge, and there's an entire generation, I would say, under the age of 35 that are poised for entrepreneurial success to kind of fill that market void. That's going to be hard for someone in their 50s who lost everything to replenish. I think we have to be very wise at how we're going to do this. We're going to have to talk about age and what does it mean to be 55 and losing a bunch of stuff versus 35 or 25 and not having anything. They're at the same point financially, but there's a different. And so we have to think, I think more micro than we have before, which is not always easy for government and kind of large institutions to do. But I think we have to get back to some of the basics of small business development, small business retention and expansion, but then also attracting some of our talent that is simply in the workforce that could be providing untapped potential for our kind of local ecosystem. That's one really, really big thing that I see. The second is that we have to re-examine the scale in which we provide funding. We have a growing, diverse population that simply doesn't have the institutional privilege of families and generations of capital, and they just don't have it. There's not a friends and family pool to get it. And if we want to get that talent into the game, we're going to have to think about how we fund grants, forgivable loans at varying scales to get those folks, and not just the restaurants and kind of the food and beverage, which is kind of sexy, but there's a lot of entrepreneurial, industrial, maker quality talent that needs access to working capital so that they can provide living wage jobs in these urban cores. And also in our surrounding metro from Coon Rapids down well past Burnsville. I mean, there's a lot of folks with talent that just can't get into the game because of the barriers. And so we have to think about a micro solution that is scalable across our region.
Noel, you are essentially a small entrepreneurial business, and the things that you've had to do to kind of build your company, what are your thoughts and ideas on that?
I would say it was a lot harder than I had expected. And you know, at the time when I was starting my business, I came from 10 years of corporate finance experience, and I had a lot of business experience. And I would say starting a business in Minnesota, it is probably the hardest thing, especially as a woman of color. And perhaps I also chose one of the most difficult businesses to start, which is construction and development. And frankly, part of the reason why, you know, D'Angelo's just hit it right on the head, it is access to capital is incredibly difficult. But I also think it's important for us to make it easier for people to take risks, so we can have innovations in our society. At this point, most of the really, really smart people are still either stuck in a job or that they don't necessarily feel like that they're valued, or maybe not necessarily contributing to their best, or the top talent is still in corporations. And so in some of those corporations, people who have those skills, we need them in the public sector and in entrepreneurial endeavors. And so, for example, one of the things that was really hard for me as a small business owner was bonding. And it's you know, as a construction business, almost all of the public projects, including most of the projects that the Met Council, you know, funds, have bonding needs. And so for every dollar that's bonded, you have to have an equal amount that's there. So for a $1 million project, you have to have $100,000 in net worth that's in the bank. And how many people can afford that? Not many. And so it's a barrier to entry. It's a barrier to business. It's a barrier to most women and minority-owned businesses. And I think it's important for us to think about it from a long-term perspective. How do we make sure that we provide easier access to starting businesses and having startup capital, and limit the barriers to entry?
Right. I want to shift with one last question, kind of building off some of the trends information before Chair Zelle, we maybe open up, because I think there might be some really good discussion and questions. And David, this is for you. You know, the national data and trends indicate that more people and jobs will move to the suburban areas rather than the urban core. Do you agree that this is a trend? Will you have to shift your business model to adjust to this trend?
I guess I agree with the data. I don't want to argue with that data, but I think that we're still kind of in the middle of the prism that is shifting the dynamic. And so it's, you know, I think we'll know a lot more at the end of 2021 than we know right now, because I think this next 3 or 4 months is going to be probably more dramatic of a behavioral shift than, you know, over the summer was, because we're going to be, you know, more in our homes. We're going to be more separated. We're going to, you know, have a harder time being able to see people. The businesses are going to have an even more difficult time. So I think we don't know for sure where this is all headed. And clearly the housing market and the stock market are doing great. And so that's really wonderful for like the 3% of Americans that have a lot of money and have a bunch of stock or wonderful homes or second homes or whatever, and they're doing great, but everybody else is having a really difficult time. And I have a hard time thinking that the rest of the real economy is not going to catch up with that little itty bitty sliver that is making a bunch of money right now. And so there's going to be I think a gradual settling out. And I think there's been a shift over the last 10 years for urbanization and to have folks kind of come in. And now there's been, a bunch of political unrest and lack of leadership for, I don't know that I want to get too far into that, but and then also, this huge pandemic moment where people are like, well, I want more space and I can afford it out there, but I can't afford it here. And so that's kind of pushed people to recalibrate. We're seeing that in the office sector for sure. We're seeing folks come out of the downtowns into some of the suburban property that we have that's more Class B and value oriented. And so we're seeing decent leasing velocity in our suburban kind of Class B office and industrial space environment, which is kind of surprising, honestly. And we're seeing a bunch of second generation restaurant space getting soaked up by new restaurants that are trying to open in like the heart of the pandemic. And we're just like, really? We've signed 3 new restaurant leases in the last, 4 months. And we're just kind of like, what? I guess it's a trend. And so I don't know that we know yet exactly where this is all going to settle out, but I think there's going to be a recalibration moment. And I think it's going to take a couple of years for us to really figure that out. We are certainly modifying how much we're trying to pour into the urban centers, partly as a response to, we just got singed pretty badly from the fires in May. And so we're kind of like, well, hold on, let's think about where else we should also be focusing our time and energy and our resources. So we're building in Blaine, we're working on building in Minnetonka on the extension, and we're building in North Minneapolis, and we're feeling really good about that. And so there's a lot of different areas where we're feeling like we should be focusing right now.
Great. I want to put it back to you, Chair Zelli, because I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And I know that there might be a lot of questions with these 3 great panelists.
Kathy, thank you so much. And Stephanie, I know you're out here somewhere. Thank you too. I have such admiration for ULI, and but especially for these panelists. Just hearing this conversation, it really, it reminds us that this is development is such a human experience, and the risk taking that you're taking, the tenacity you're showing, and that as Met Council, we need to do more than just look at maps. We need to be talking to you and understanding how we can support what is so important in the thinking about Lake Street and thinking about North Broadway and how can you keep it affordable. And David, we've talked about this. It's this is an area where we're putting in some of this new transit to help support. But if we can't keep the economy or keep some of those entrepreneurs alive to that, not coming for a few years, it's a challenge. So anyway, my deep admiration to all of you. There's Stephanie. And we have some questions. Linnea, you're ready to ask. Go ahead.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the panelists and for having this opportunity to chat. I want to go back to something that D'Angelo's mentioned, and I hope when we in the future get a conversation with the governor's office, we can hear more about this. I just can't impress upon people enough. What does it mean if you look at the people who look like you and your family? 50% of them lost their employment during this pandemic. I just, I don't know that I haven't heard of what's a plan, but we have certain demographics that based by simply the color of their skin, we can say that is their situation. And the other piece about this, to the last point, is that these populations are the growing populations of our state and our region. They're not something else. So I just want to make sure we don't gloss past that. Was wonderful that was shared and pointed out, but that's a critical, if we can get to it, it's an important issue. It's a critical issue when we look at Black, Indigenous, Latinx populations in our metro area. Nawal mentioned this as well. Capital and access to capital is important. It's also something that we find over time and time again that people from these communities who absolutely qualify for support are not given it at the same rate as their peers from white populations. So I just want to, point out we have those institutional issues that we know. It's proven, it's documented with every recession. We see it come again and again and again. Those most harmed, the last to recover or never recovered, because some of those populations never recovered from 2008. And when compared to the same type of performance, credit, plan to their peers, that's where the disparities show up. So I just want to make sure when we have our conversations going forward and we're hearing, and having conversations with the governor and having our opportunities, that we're keeping those key realities front of mind. So thanks everybody for your comments and your thoughtfulness and your work.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Councilmember Vento, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This morning, excuse me just a sec. I've got to go take care of a dog.
Right. We're going to hear back from her in a minute. Anybody else?
Go
ahead, Chai. Councilmember Lee.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Abdi, you can go next. I want to thank the staff and the chair and all the presenters and the panelists for a great conversation we just had. And to Noel's point earlier about the financial barriers, I saw a documentary about the first and only Black-owned weed dispensary in Denver. And many years after they've legalized recreational marijuana, there's only one Black-owned dispensary business. And the couple was saying that when they applied, they had to prove to the bank that they had $500,000 in the bank. And so that's a ridiculous amount of money. And so my point is that we have to look at our contracting services and our vending contracts and the way we do business as a system. We have to find out what barriers are keeping smaller companies and corporations from rising up and being competitive in our processes. And so I just really appreciate this conversation, and I hope we can continue it in that vein. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Sue. I know you had a question.
Thank you. He wants to pipe in on this conversation. This morning on public radio, Chris Farrell was interviewing, I believe it was Gary Cunningham, a former Minneapolitan who is now the head of Prosperity Now in Washington, D.C. They had quite a rich conversation about economic development, lifting all people, and it was a great conversation. If there's any way for us to get a copy of that program, I think it would be great for all of us to hear it. And in particular, they talked about the capital issue that Noel was mentioning and how there are examples of providing some of the most costly items, i.e. a location, as part of an incentive to get folks to take the risk and to try business development. And it was a fabulous conversation, really good stories from people who have had good experiences, and of course those that were more challenging. But if it's possible to get a copy of it, I'd like to hear the whole thing, because I was parallel parking and only hearing portions of it, but it was great. And frankly, Chris Farrell and Gary Cunningham could really.
And maybe I could just jump on Sue's comment. Now, while Gary used to run META here, you would talk about the barriers, as I understand, bonding. You mentioned working capital, for small businesses. Is META a resource? Are there others that you're finding there to be in your own story?
Yeah, so I know Gary. He was one of my mentors when he lived here prior to moving to Washington, D.C. And someone who knows what it's like to work as an entrepreneur, worked with entrepreneurs, has helped them with capital. as you know, business is very risky, and AMITA provides a loan and they charge 6%, which is typically higher than what a bank would charge you. And so for most people who are in construction, construction is one of the least margin profitable businesses, if you can think about. And so typically you're looking at 3 to 5% margin on a project that maybe perhaps it is 100,000 to 20 million, 30 million, whatever it is. And most small businesses are not going to do the larger projects. So if you can think about it, if you're borrowing money for 6% and you're making a profit of 3%, you can just imagine the numbers don't make sense. And so there are businesses that are much more sort of, I would say, reasonably well-equipped to work with MITAs and maybe perhaps financial institutions. I would say most businesses, especially startup businesses with high risk, you need a different kind of capital, which is what DeAngelis was kind of talking about, which is sort of, I call it patient capital is what investors call it. And typically it comes with a lot less cost. And it's mostly to really enrich an entrepreneurial community and make sure that the state that we are living in is for the next 100 years, that we can create more 3Ms and more Medtronics. And it's really thinking long-term sort of investment and economic development rather than short-term sort of, I would say, investment.
I'll just point out that Reva Chambliss just put the link for that radio segment in the chat. So take a look at that. And Noel, your point about home-growing businesses, even the future big businesses, they start at a small level.
Absolutely.
Chair, sorry, this is Councilmember Muse. May I go?
Oh, hi, yeah, Abdi, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I just want to thank our great panelists and especially give a special shout out to Noel. I know she's really doing a great job in the community, and she's doing a phenomenal job in really reducing, access to housing for the most vulnerable parts of our community. And the question is to Noel, what can we do as a Met Council to really help communities like you to give access to opportunities that we offer? Where do you see what we can do differently?
That's a really good question. How much time do we have? I would love to spend some more time on this because I feel like I will just tell you, I'll give you a perfect example. I have never done as a contractor a Met Council funded project and the Met Council has significant inclusion goals, but there are significant barriers. And so I'm on the state stakeholders or disparity study stakeholders and committee, and there were 9 entities. Met Council, was actually part of it. In 2018, the disparity study came out and found that less than half of 1% of those 9 entities, which spent more than $7 billion in 1 year, went to African Americans and Blacks in the state, which was a really disappointing number. But it showed that we have so much work to do around inclusion. It's not just having goals. You can have goals around workforce development. You can have goals around business inclusion, but you also have ways for people to really not necessarily take into account the challenges that are facing some of the businesses that you want to build and develop. And we need to make sure that we address those barriers and remove those barriers, in addition to having significant inclusion goals. I think of things, we just finished a $50 million job for Target, and there is no bond on that job. And we had 50% inclusion around workforce development and 40% inclusion on businesses that were owned by women and people of color, including indigenous communities. And that was something I put myself in charge of. And I have a commitment as a social entrepreneur to make sure that we do include our businesses and our communities are built by people that live there and come from there and work there. And that's the only and the best way to achieve economic equality and wealth building for our communities. And one of the things that I was looking at, this disparity study that was done in 1990. And interestingly enough, the numbers did not change. And the reason is not because we don't have inclusion goals, it's because we don't have effective goals. And we have to think about it in a different manner. And so Councilman Member Musa, I appreciate the shout out, but I would love to have a more sort of a dialogue that is more effective and more methodical in the ways that that the council really does work and funds projects and opportunities around affordable housing, commercial development. The next 40 years are going to be really critical for Minnesota, is in the forefront of an innovation and how we change equitable development and inclusion on community development as well. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I would just say it's just a long-term discussion that I'd love to have and engage in with the council members.
Well, now, while you started the answer and you really inspired us to keep asking, so thank you. I know from my experience at MnDOT, large projects, goals, compliance, that doesn't do it. Actually finding different, carving up projects, taking risks, it's a different technique, and it has to go beyond just the goal setting traditional government mandate. I know, and Linnea, we'll get to you in a minute, but we have a few others. Chris, go ahead. You haven't spoken yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, a lot of the points made were really good points. I think D'Angelo and I have spent some time talking about some of these issues already. And, I think from the council's perspective, we are trying to do things or think about things or getting the right people together to think about things in a different way, right? So I think that the challenge that the state has and the government entities have is we are thinking incrementally and linearly. And we're trying to go from 0.5% in essence in spend to 20% to be an equitable view of the world, right? And so to continue to grow at even if we grew at 20% per year, we go from 0.5% to 0.6 to 7.2 to 0.72. I mean, it's going to be, I'll be like dead and gone a long time before we hit the goal. We have to think about this in a non-linear fashion, much the same way as the state, let's say, thought about COVID testing, right? And said, we are going to figure out how to get massive amounts of testing done because it's an essential thing to the health and wellness and well-being of our state, right? Minneapolis has recently said that racism and disparities is a public health emergency. We need to treat it like an emergency and not continue to have legal issues and other things and I understand there's all kinds of reasons why we can't do things. And if we continue to say, anytime there's any little reason why we can't do it, we'll just leave status quo. All of us should spend a lot of time doing something else because in 20 years, we will still be at 0.5%, like we've not moved until in the last 20 years. And I think what you're hearing from people in the community loud and clear is that we need to fundamentally change how we think about this problem. I think we can solve this problem in a matter of 2 or 3 years. We could be on the right track. We probably need some legislative changes as well as changes in the way people think about things and the way people do things. It is a solvable problem that this state has chosen not to solve for the last 40 or 50 years. And until people acknowledge that it's a choice to not solve it and to accept the level of disparities, then people are going to continue to have the same problem. And so we as a Met Council, we as part of the administration have to stand up and say, we are no longer going to choose to have status quo. That's not acceptable for us. We have great leaders like Noel and D'Angelo. I mean, I've known David Wellington's dad for a long time. People that think differently about business and are willing to engage and do things differently, bring them into the conversation, and let's figure out how to get this done because I think the community wants to get it done. We just have to decide that we're willing to take some risks, make some changes, and make it happen.
Thanks, Chris. Riva.
Yes, I'm appreciating the panel discussion and your frank feedback, the council members' response. We have a great amount of commitment and one of the key things that you said, Chris, this is an emergency. We're in a crisis. And if we continue down this road, not only will we be continuing down this road, but we're going to be going in a decline, not just from the micro level, but from a macro level. We have a partnership with MSP to help address that issue. But I think what we need to do is turn the dial up and start moving in a direction that is going to move the pace faster and take advantage of our leadership as a regional planning organization and working with partners like our panelists to move things down the road quicker.
Thanks, Rita. And the other, Linnea.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to answer that question from my perspective, and something that I hope people in community really take to heart, because I think a lot, institutions, leaders, we come and go. People in our roles, staff come and go, but community is around. They're the holders of our institutional knowledge oftentimes. So one of the things that was really big for me coming up through my education and time was change the policy, change the goals and the metrics. And that's what we have really focused on, and still people are focusing on. And when you have that big win, we change that policy, we're done. What we're learning is it's in the implementation, right? And so the implementation is made up by us, policymakers, it's made up by staff, and it's made up by the people in our community, businesses, community members, social enterprises, nonprofits, philanthropy, our local governments. We've had, to my knowledge, one person of color receive funding in my time at the Met Council, and I think maybe in a long time. And let me tell you what it took for that person who had an approved program, an approved project, to actually get the money. It took myself, Council Member Lilligren, it took city council members from 3 different areas in the city that they were in, the city staff person, Representative Fu Lee, shout out to him. It took too much. It took too much. And I also think a big part of that is the staff. And in that situation, we had staff shift, a staffing shift, which all of a sudden made this project possible, where it had been through the same process, same measuring stick as all the other processes. So I want to say that there are things we do institutionally when it comes to implementation that are too difficult, and it's not the same process for everyone, and that we all have a stake in that. Local governments also need to support and promote diverse projects coming forward to the Met Council. They need to get behind them and champion them. And then when they get into our space, we have to make sure we're not getting in our own way of these goals. And community needs to help hold us accountable, not to the policy, but to the implementation of the policy. And I hate to say it because it took a lot of work. But I've been in one of those positions where we got the policy passed, we're done. And I stepped away. And when I stepped away, it all got undone. So I just think that that is what needs to happen too. And we all have a role to play in that and to acknowledge in that. And I hope we can learn, and that we don't just have one project that we're funding that comes from a community that I'm actually hopeful. People want to be in their neighborhoods. They don't want to leave. And they have tons of brilliant ideas and businesses and opportunities that can build our economy greater from where it is today. We're not getting the most productivity out of our economy because of the disparities of including those people in. So I think that we have more to do. I don't think it's a less than or on a decline. If we can remove these disparities, keeping these communities back, we'll actually have more GDP than we had before.
Chair, I think you were on mute.
It always takes somebody to look after me. Thank you, Rita. I was staring at Robert, knowing how thoughtful he always is, and I was going to call you out. I was like, do you have any thoughts on this that you can share or ask?
You know, I appreciate it and thanks. And I was actually part of a conversation earlier today where I was on the panel talking about very, very similar dynamics.
I heard about that.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, the word gets out, I guess. So I just really want to thank the panelists as well. I just think it was really a rich conversation, and thank my colleagues for engaging in it. And these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have, and really lift up what Noel said about access to capital. There's also access to data or technical assistance, but it's that access to capital. And I guess remind us that access to capital isn't sort of accidental, or it really isn't based. It's based on a systemic withholding, a historic systemic withholding of the access to that capital, and of intergenerational or generational, not just wealth building, but wealth hoarding that was very deliberate to exclude certain people within our culture, and that we're going to have to get really surgical and figure out how to get closer to the sort of grassroots partners. I think it was D'Angelo that was talking about, and maybe work with less traditional sort of organizations, financial institutions, community-based CDFIs, for example, that can really provide the direct technical support, systems navigation, get upstream a lot of the brilliant people that our panelists were talking about, who are maybe working wage jobs now, but would be really engines to an economic recovery, or our economic environment here. May need credit repair. I mean, these really granular things. They may need people walking them through navigating systems. And so here we have some partners right in front of us that can do that. There are more out there, but we really need to, if we're serious, or if we want to see the dial move in our lifetimes, as Councilmember Ferguson was talking about, we have to get kind of granular here. And the last thing I'll say, I'm a Minneapolis rep, so I'll say this about Minneapolis. I'm a Minneapolis resident, have been most of my life. And, we're at a really critical point here, and for not good reasons. We have the eyes of the world on us, and since the murder of George Floyd. And Minneapolis is an important hub within our entire region. And so the health of Minneapolis should concern us all. But it matters right now how we respond, what we do next, what this, we don't talk about recovery because we don't really want to get back to where we were. We want to do better. And so I would say the future and health of the city of Minneapolis, but also as the hub of the region, our whole region's future and health is really, balancing. And so we're privileged to be in these positions, these decision-making positions, and the quality of the decisions that we make in the near future are going to have reverberating impact on whether we how we thrive going forward within this region. So thanks, Chair, for asking.
Well, and I don't want to leave the space for anybody's comments, but I know we're over time. But you know what? This is such a kind of stimulating and important conversation. I'm just so grateful for our visitors to be here and give us information and inspire us and call us to the reason we're all doing this as councilmen. Any other thoughts? Because I know it's it's dark, but it's winter. So what else are we going to do? But I know we have to go out to dinner. Kathy, any closing?
Chair, I just want to really thank the staff for setting this opportunity, and the panelists. And I am very inspired by the conversation that we need to move forward in a different way. There was some great concrete ideas that I know will be captured. I think just the somehow backing and supporting bonding for smaller companies of color is just a really concrete step, as well as the idea that Linnea had with regards to, you change policy, you change goals and metrics, but if you don't change implementation, then you're not really making progress. And so I'm very inspired by all the ideas and thoughts. And I just thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. And if there's other ways that ULI Minnesota, with all of our real estate expertise, can be a part in the next conversation, please let me know, because we are looking at ways to also look within and think differently as well, because we are all part of the solution. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, ULI. We really do value the partnership, as you said, and with the regional council of mayors, of which I know you mentioned Molly and others who have been active. Yes, we're in a period of tremendous change, and being in a regional government and leadership, it's a really daunting responsibility. So we rely on our partners and our better judgment to keep this conversation going. So, Nawal, DeAngelis, where's David? Thank you so much for giving us your time and your thoughts. And yes, I think we should really have a continuing kind of relationship. We will kind of call on you. You can call on us. And I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts or comments, but we will be meeting again soon. And I just want to thank all the council members for being present and spending extra time, because this is all foundational. I love the idea that this is about implementation, but we're also going to set a vision for the next 10 years, and we're starting that work too. So we have to kind of live at different levels, and we can remind each other to not at those different levels, not be too high, not be too low. It's a big task for us. So this meeting was great. It's time to adjourn. Great to see everybody. Enjoyed. There's ice on the lake, so I think winter's coming. So okay, enjoy the holiday. We'll see you. We'll see you very soon. Bye bye.
Thanks for having us.